Hey guys, before we get started on today's episode, if you wouldn't mind supporting the channel just by liking and subscribing, if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just leave a review for us. And even if you're on YouTube, just comment down below what you want us to hear about or what you want us to talk about. It really helps us get even bigger guests and helps us grow even more. If you want to support us on a further level and you live in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area and you want to work with us or just see if we're a good fit, click the first link down below in the description. You'll book a call from the comfort of your own home, get to know us a little bit better, our style, how we plan to sell or help you buy your first home or maybe second home, whatever it might be. We just go over your situation. It's completely free. All right, without further ado, let's get into the episode. All right, guys, welcome back to the Canadian Real Estate Homefront Podcast. I'm fanboying today because Mike Moffatt has come on the podcast today. He agreed to come on. So if you don't know who Mike is, he's a pretty big, figure in the space in economics and in real estate. He talks a lot on different news channels. He's the founder and director of Place Center. He's the host of what I believe is a new podcast called the Missing Middle Podcast, which is really interesting. He's got about 50,000 followers on Twitter, and he actually used to be an economic advisor to Justin Trudeau back in the day. I kind of looked up your resume a bit there, but Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. All right. So I thought we could just start with are we in a recession? So I was watching the About That on CBC that Andrew Chang does, and your face popped up, and I was like, oh, there's a familiar guy. You can't miss you from your hair. And basically, so for our audience, the preface was that, look, we have growing GDP, and most economists consider two negative quarters of GDP means that we're in a recession. We haven't had that. But when you look at GDP per capita, so the output per person, we've actually been negative for what I believe is 8 straight quarters. So they were saying that immigration is kind of pushing our GDP up because the more people you have coming to the country, these people need to spend to get clothes, to get housing, to get food, XYZ. So I guess in your opinion, what do you think about Canada right now? Are we in a recession right now? And yeah, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges we, use recession to be, a synonym for bad economic times. But this is one of the cases where I think you can be in bad economic times and not technically be in a recession. So, as you point out, real GDP is increasing, so the size of the pie is increasing. But the size of the population is growing faster, so each of our individual shares is getting smaller, and I do think it shows kind of structural weakness in the economy. That yes, GDP is growing, but a lot of the reasons why it's growing is the international student boom. So we've got international students who are coming over, paying 30, 40, $50,000 a year in tuition to colleges and universities, having to pay rent, and then often sort of working in the economy, either in the traditional economy or the gig economy, driving for Uber Eats or Skip or whatever. But that's not a really kind of sustainable way to grow the economy. We're not seeing a lot of productivity growth. We're not seeing a lot of, great new startups or things like that. That we have this economic model over the last couple of years based on just unsustainable population growth. The federal government's doing a number of things to address that, but overall, I think we're going to have to find better ways to grow the economy, because that's just not a sustainable path. Where yes, Canada's GDP is larger, but each of us is getting slightly less every quarter.
When you were an advisor to Justin Trudeau, if you can speak about it,
Yep.
were these kind of his policies back then? I feel like a lot of people like Ben Rabideau, I don't know if you were in the room for any of these conversations, was saying that our population growth is too explosive and we don't have the housing for it and we don't have the infrastructure for it. And it's not a us versus them thing. It's just a reality. I think that a lot of Canadians right now are speaking up about mass immigration. They're not against immigration.
Yeah.
And I think there's kind of this new word going around, responsible immigration. So should 19 international students be living in a house? God, no. Should they be living under a bridge in Brampton, paying 4x for some degrees that are, let's call it how it is, they're useless. They're puppy mill colleges. So I wonder back then, was this kind of Justin's policy? And when did it kind of ramp up into let's get more international students to come to Canada and kind of see what happens?
Yeah, so the short answer is no. I mean, this is all relatively new. So, back when I was doing advisory work, this was 2013 to 2015. So, up until the point of which the 2015 election. No, it essentially wasn't. And interestingly enough, if you go back to 2013, 2014, the Liberal Party was talking about the need to reduce the number of temporary foreign workers. So they were actually talking about going in the other direction, right? At the time, if you go back to 2013, the biggest user of temporary foreign workers was a chain of Wendy's restaurants in Calgary, and you saw the liberals in the opposition at the time going like what the heck is going on? Like, why can't Wendy's find workers to work in Calgary? So no, in fact, it was the opposite. Since then, we've had three things happen. I would say two of which were planned, one of which was unplanned. So the first thing that we had was the increase in immigration targets. That was planned. Like, that was a conscious decision that the government made to grow the population, to deal with an aging population. The second thing that happened was a big increase in temporary foreign workers in 2022, 2023. And this was basically coming out of the pandemic. Our economy was super hot. We had a whole bunch of inflation, and the government decided, hey, we can do something about that by bringing in a bunch of workers. I think that was a bad idea. I think they shouldn't have done it, but that was a conscious choice. But the big thing that happened was this international student boom. And I would actually say it's worse than a bad plan. It was no plan, right? Like, there was nobody who got up one day and consciously decided that, hey, we should allow the number of international students to go up like 4 or 5x in a few years. That how international students work is it's left to until recently it's left to the individual colleges and universities to decide how many they want. So there's no cap, there's no target. Each college and university makes that decision for themselves, and the role of the federal government was to basically go, okay, do you meet the criteria? Do you have enough money to live, that kind of thing? If you do, we'll stamp yes. And I think we're sort of realizing that hands-off approach was a mistake, to basically outsource a large part of the immigration system to colleges and universities. It was probably not a great idea, just because they have different incentives than the rest of us. So, you take a Conestoga College in Kitchener-Waterloo, their incentive is to let in as many students as possible, to get as much tuition as possible. They're not thinking about the housing market. They're not thinking about the labor market. That's really none of their business. So because we allowed colleges and universities to make that decision, they weren't doing it in what was the best interest of Canada. They were doing it in what was the best interest of their individual institutions.
That's interesting. So also now what we're seeing too is Canadian employers taking low wage workers who are non-permanent residents, I believe. A report just came out, and basically you're kind of pushing down the wages to get these non-temporary foreign workers while unemployment is going up. So I always think about this, like, who are and what is the federal government doing to bring people in? They always keep saying, well, there's this labor shortage. There's no shortage. I live in Toronto. There's no shortage of Uber drivers, Uber bikers, those kind of people. Also, it's very low skill, right? You look at the LCBO. I'm not saying LCBO is low skill, but they had a job fair, and it was just around the corner for any sort of cashier. You see it the same at grocery stores. I could keep going on and on. So you're bringing in a lot of low skill work, but then you have Huntsville, Ontario, asking a doctor to come stay there for 5 years, and we'll give you an $80,000 bonus. I was also reading that they've offered people waterfront properties. They'll forgive their student loan debts. So it feels like, okay, maybe there is a labor shortage in some departments, but it's definitely not low skill labor. Do you think I have that right? Or I'd love to know your
Yeah,
opinion.
I think you have it absolutely right. That we do have a doctor shortage. We do have a shortage in some of the skilled trades and areas like that. We could certainly, our tech firms in Toronto, Kitchener, Waterloo, Vancouver, they could use some high skilled work. But where we're seeing the big population increase is in, again, temporary foreign workers in what they call like the low wage stream. Right. So that's fast food workers, people who work at like fish processing plants out in Atlantic, Canada, and so on. And then coupled with international students. Now, 5 or 10 years from now, many of those international students will be high skilled like workers, after they finish their degree or diploma. But, these kids are like 19, 20, 21 years old, right? So when they're not in class, they're, probably driving an Uber or, working at Wendy's or what have you. So we have this big mismatch. And again, I would fully agree that I think the federal government made a mistake coming out of the pandemic to bring in increasing number of temporary foreign workers in the low wage stream. It went from about 30,000 to 80,000. It more than doubled overnight. And that's going to drive down wages. And you mentioned the LCBO example and all these other examples. One came out recently, the CNE, like the big Toronto fair. They had 38,000 people in line for those temporary jobs, over double what they had last year. So we're kind of showing that, yeah, for every one of these kind of lower wage jobs, we have 5, 10, 15 people applying. So we have this big mismatch of, a lot of lower wage workers and not so many low wage jobs.
Yeah, that the CNE is right around the corner for me, and I'm not excited when it comes to town because it's the traffic's so bad. So you have 38,000 people lining up there. It makes it even crazier. But I wanted to pivot just a little bit here to the big thing on the show, which is housing. We're seeing the birth rate hit a new low, which is really sad, I think personally. You're seeing a lot of young people leave big cities. What I have noticed when I studied past cycles is when you have an inflated housing market, it's actually really bad for everyone who's not in the market.
Yeah.
It creates, yeah, like I said, it creates declining birth rates, which it's on par with the data. And it forces people to leave big cities, which is, I think, what we're seeing right now. So I guess my long-winded question is, what are you kind of seeing in housing? Do you think we're in a bubble? Do you think that um, the incomes have just gotten way too out of whack, the median incomes to house prices in certain parts of the country? And yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, well, certainly there's no question that the house prices relative to incomes are just completely unaffordable. Like that old 3x rule that Gen Xers and boomers used to use, that's gone out the window pretty much everywhere, right? You're looking 8x, and then Toronto is more like 12 to 15x income, which is just completely unaffordable unless you have parental wealth or that kind of thing. So yeah, absolutely, these things are out of whack. Now, challenge is it hasn't actually really been a bubble because of those kind of demographic fundamentals, right? Where you've got the population is growing so much, you just have this competition for housing where you get investors buying up single family homes and turning them into student rentals and that kind of thing. And then the question on birth rates, you're absolutely right. And there's actually interesting research out of the UK on this issue, the effect of home price increases on birth rates. And it actually tends to be two-sided, that if you don't own a home, you see birth rates going down for that cohort, renters and so on. Just because they don't have the money to save up, and they're often going, well, I can't afford to save for a home and have a kid at the same time. I've got to pick a lane here, so I'm just going to continue saving. So the birth rate for renters drops. And clearly, if you're living with mom and dad, you're probably not getting married and not having kids. So that absolutely drops. On the other side, for existing homeowners, it actually goes up slightly because of a wealth effect, right? So if you are 32, you bought a home for say 600,000, and then next year is 900,000, you're actually slightly more likely to have more kids, right? Because you're like, oh, well, like I'm wealthy now, I can afford it, and so on. The challenge is those things don't even out, right? That the effect on the renters is much larger than the effect on the existing homeowners. So that is absolutely playing a role. And I think one of the other things playing a role is the big shift we've had over the last 20 years. House starts are about the same as they were 20 years ago in Ontario. It's that kind of 70 to 95,000 range. But 20 years ago, we were building a lot more single detached and row housing, 3, 4, 5 bedroom units. Whereas now that 80,000 or whatever, about 50,000 of that is apartments, either condos or rentals, most of which are 1 bedroom. So even when we're building the same number of homes, that composition is changing rapidly, or has changed over the last 20 years. And you're far more likely to have kids if you own a 3 or 4 bedroom home versus, owning a studio condo in downtown Toronto.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually saw that Peterborough, Ontario. I think there's 100,000 people that live there, roughly, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, but they built more three-bedroom homes than the whole city of Toronto did. So that's pretty scary. And what Toronto led the way in was these bachelor-style units, which don't have a bedroom. Who's buying these? Investors. So, like for me, I think it's a dangerous game that Canada played to have your home be an ATM with a home equity line of credits. I'm not saying that I think investors are the problem, but I do think it's a bit of a dangerous game where you haven't really realized that gain because you haven't sold the home. So the bank saying, "Okay, I'm going to lend you money at X rate on your home as collateral, and then you can go do what you want with it, aka go buy a pre-construction property or something along those lines, right?" And I think you touched on something that you hear every politician talk about. We need to increase supply, which we're not doing. But how do we decrease demand, which I think is the easier part of the equation? And to me, that's nothing against immigration. It's just the reality is that when people come, they need a roof over their head. And if you don't have enough roofs, then prices are going to be elevated, or you're going to have too many people living in a three-bedroom townhome in Brampton, as an example, when there was 19 people there. So I guess what's your kind of thought? You're Mike Moffatt. All of a sudden, you
Yeah.
get the job of the housing minister, who was formerly the immigration minister, which is just an ironic thing to me. But I guess that's another subject for another day. How would you kind of fix housing in big cities, or would you just say, well, if you want to buy a house, you got to move?
Yeah, no, so I think the latter, I think is unsustainable, particularly at a macro level. So for an individual, it might make sense. It's like, okay, you know what? If you earn a nurse's salary, you shouldn't live in Toronto, and you should go move to Thunder Bay or Windsor or somewhere else. Okay, fine, but that doesn't work at a macro level. Like, you can't have all the patients living in Toronto and all the nurses living in Sudbury, right? It just doesn't work. We need to have our cities need to be open to the middle class, right? So that's just not a sustainable solution. Saying, okay, well, the middle class just shouldn't live in cities, because we see what happens. I would point people to the San Francisco Bay Area. Look at, this is what happens when you have a city that is no longer open to the middle class, where you're having schools having to provide housing for teachers and things like that. And there's big shortages of all these middle class workers, simply because the middle class got priced out. So that is not an option. I absolutely agree that we have to look at that nexus of housing and population growth. And I think the government's the federal government is very late to the game, but I think they're starting to make some of the right moves. Again, first thing I would do is massively ratchet down temporary foreign workers. On the low wage side, I would basically say, I'm going to end this program in 3 years. This is going to zero. We don't need it. Wendy's can find their own workers, and oh my God, if they have to raise wages, that's not the end of the world. We do need to look at the international student side. Again, the federal government has capped that. I think that was totally the right call. The Bank of Canada has called into question the federal government's timeline and commitment to that plan. So, they need to actually see that through. And then on the immigration side, I think when we're setting targets, we need to have housing in mind. And I think we need to set longer term targets. Traditionally what happens is the federal government, and this has worked this way, well before the Trudeau government. It's been this way for about 30 years, where, like November 1st, they say, okay, this is the immigration target for next year. It's going to be 500,000 or 400,000 or whatever. Go, and then you guys sort of figure out how to deal with that. Well, you can't build a house right away. You can't build a school right away, right? So, announcing these things with like 60 days notice just doesn't work. I think we need to have a longer term perspective, where we say, okay, here's our 10-year plan on immigration. Here's how we're going to make sure that if we're bringing in 400,000, 500,000, or 100,000, that housing can keep up with that. But these decisions in Ottawa, and I live, I live right in the Ottawa bubble here where all the policymakers live. That, immigration, you have the immigration folks who work on immigration policy and they just make it in a silo. Then you have the housing minister and the housing folks who make housing policy. And then you have the labor folks making labor policy. And there's no integration between them. So I think we see the effects of that everything's kind of broken because none of these policies interact with each other very well. And there's no kind of long-term plan or long-term thinking about any of this.
I think that that makes a lot of sense. I think that it's coming out and saying the hard truth of like, okay, we're capping this program. It needs to stop. This is why. It is truly something that more news outlets need to start having a conversation about and us holding politicians accountable. Everyone likes to say, I know people called you a doomer recently, and they say the same thing about they say the same thing about me sometimes, but I don't think what I'm saying is doom. It's pointing out something that doesn't make sense anymore and that a lot of people are frustrated with and saying, hey, you are a politician. Yes, you got elected in, but you are paid by the people of the country and people are struggling. This system isn't working anymore. And it's time for you guys to take it a bit more seriously. To pivot to Ottawa, like you said, what I've noticed is job growth. I think that everyone knows the public sector seems to be ballooning at this rapid rate, while the private sector here continues to fall. Adding the capital gains tax, I don't think people don't think it's much, but I think that it hurts doctors, what we need, and these people who have corporations and X, Y, Z. Is the government spending way too much money on the wrong things, like inflating the public sector? Could they take that money and put it towards better ideas? Kind of like, I guess Pierre Poilievre is very vocal about what he thinks should be done. He thinks that if municipalities don't want NIMBYism, if they don't want more density, they won't get money from the federal government. I know this is a long-winded question. There's a few parts here, but do you think that Pierre Poilievre's ideas make sense to help the housing crisis, to take away money from municipalities if they aren't willing to build enough density for the housing crisis that we face?
Yeah, so it's a couple parts of there.
Mhm.
So on the federal public service side, I'm married to a federal public servant, so I'm not a disinterested observer when it comes to that question. But I do think we need to look at it, and in a very kind of specific way, going, okay, like why has it increased? What are these people doing? Do we need all of those jobs? I actually think that will be fairly easy to unwind. A lot of these positions have been in kind of temp contracts. Yeah, this is kind of inside the Ottawa bubble, but the federal government, particularly for new workers, will often hire people on these kind of 6-month contracts, kind of trial basis. There seems to be a lot of those right now. So it would be fairly easy for either this government or a new government to say, hey, we're just going to cut back on that. And you would see the number of public servants fall pretty dramatically in a short period of time. So that is easy to unwind, but you also want to make sure that if you're doing that, that you're still going to be able to get a passport, or veterans are still going to get their benefits. So I think it is important to look at what they're doing. On the incentive side, it's really interesting that you hear Trudeau and Poilievre completely punching each other in the face on housing policy. But on this one, there's actually not that much difference between the two. That Poilievre's bill, I think it's Bill 356. I'm not great at remembering these things, but basically says, okay, if certain cities don't meet a housing target given to them by the federal government, they will lose infrastructure funding. And it's only a certain list of cities. It's only cities with populations over 300,000 that would lose this, which it's actually a little or 200. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was only a certain list of, I think there was about 17 cities that this would apply to, that they had to be a certain size and they had to be a certain housing price, certain level of housing prices. The federal government's basically doing the same thing with their new infrastructure and housing accelerator fund. That the housing accelerator fund has a provision in it for each city. So that's the fund that they give cities to, if cities legalize fourplexes and do a bunch of things, they get a certain amount of money. Well, in there, and the federal government's been really bad at publicizing this. there are provisions in these contracts that they do have to hit certain housing levels or they get that funding taken away. So it's very similar. The Polyev people are basically saying like, okay, if you don't do this, we'll take your money away. Whereas the Trudeau folks are like, okay, if you don't do this, we won't give you money. But that's kind of like two sides of the same coin here. And I think the challenge of both of these are they're riddled with loopholes. Again, Polyev's only listed about 17 or 18 cities on his plan. And then the federal government, again, is doing things like they've got a new infrastructure plan. And one of the provisions is that municipalities cannot raise development charges. But they've limited it to cities of 300,000 people or more. So then you get a city like Burnaby out in BC, massive housing shortage, massive housing crisis, but they've only got 250,000 people. So then they can do whatever the heck they want with development charges and not get dinged by this. So I think that's one thing that both Trudeau and Poilievre have to work on is all of these kind of loopholes that they've put in this program. But I think at a high level, I think they both had the right idea that, some cities in Canada are slowing housing growth, and the federal government gives those cities a lot of money. So they should be able to use that federal spending power to say, hey, look, like if you're not playing ball here, we're not going to fund your subway. We're not going to give you this extra funding for roads. So I do think this is a good approach, but I actually don't think there's all that much daylight between Trudeau and Poilievre on this.
What do you think about development charges? It seems like it's about 30% of the actual cost to build. So it seems very high. And I understand development charges from like a high kind of picture is like, okay, we need them for new water, new infrastructure because there's going to be more people living there. But are they just way too high? Is it a money grab for these cities to, I don't know, fund their budget in a way? And then at the end of the day, I think people think, well, builders should pay more XYZ, but then when they do their pro forma, those numbers go into the pro forma and they eventually just get passed along to the, say the couple who's a nurse and a police officer, people who actually are making this country go round, as an example, right? These important jobs that people have. And that's just an example. There's tons of other more important jobs, but I just wonder, are these development charges, just a way to garnish more money to spend on things that maybe some cities and municipalities don't even need?
Yes, absolutely. So to give you an example, I'm 47 years old. We bought our first house 20 years ago in London, Ontario. The house is $168,000, and the development charge was $5,000 to pay for all that. Today in London, 20 years later, development charges in London are $47,000. They've gone up like 900 or close to 900%. We've seen in the city of Toronto, we've had two hikes of development charges on one-bedroom condos in the last 12 months. It's gone from, it was like 35,000 to about 54. So it's gone up 42%. So you go, okay, well, what the heck is going on here, right? Like, yes, there's been inflation in the construction sector, but 900% inflation or 42% inflation in 12 months, like it just doesn't bear water. And how these development charges work is they're under, at least in Ontario, they're under provincial law, where the province says, hey, you can assess development charges, and those charges go into a fund and can be spent on capital infrastructure, so roads, water treatment, and so on. But that money should only fund the sort of cost of growth, right? This idea of growth pays for growth. That this would be infrastructure you're only having to build because your city's growing. But like anything else, it's hard to know, from the city's point of view, like what are things that you would have to do if you're growing, what are things that you wouldn't have to do. So the rules are left really vague, really open, and allow cities to get very creative in what they're funding or what they're assessing development charges for, because it prevents taxing existing homeowners, or it just prevents them from saying, hey, this infrastructure is costing too much, so we won't do it. So you have a situation like in Kitchener, where they're paying, I think it's about $120 million for this new state of the art soccer complex. I love soccer. I'm a sports guy, all for it. But like almost the entire thing is being paid for by development charges, right? Despite the fact that, existing residents of Kitchener and people who don't even live in Kitchener are going to get to use this thing. So, right now we are putting all of these taxes on, new home buyers in Kitchener to pay for a soccer stadium, which frankly is kind of a nice to have, not a must have, but that's going to get used by everyone. So it just raises up the cost of housing, because you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, developers aren't paying it. It's homeowners, right? That gets passed along in the bill. It shows up in the pro forma. So it is a huge issue. I think we need to reform these. I think we need to look at how we fund infrastructure and do things like if we're spending the money on new water treatment plants, what we can do instead is have the municipal government debt finance that and then pay for that over time, by putting a little amount on everybody's water bill. It's the same way we fund hydro infrastructure. We could fund water infrastructure the same way. So I absolutely do think we need to look at these, because cities basically treat it as free money, right? Because it doesn't, existing taxpayers don't have to pay for it. And the only people who end up getting dinged by this are people who, generally speaking, don't currently live in the city anyway. So it is a massive issue. Again, make me housing czar of all three levels of government. I think that's the first thing I do, actually, is really try and reform development charges. I think it's, on the supply side, it's the number one issue that we have in this province.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. And speaking of developers, like what I noticed being a real estate agent and in sales, I never really did much in pre-con in terms of selling those projects, and I actually kind of pride myself on it. But what we're noticing is that a lot of these developers have gone into receivership. They took on too much risk. They're actually not even breaking ground because people aren't paying money for it. And a big thing is that they need to charge more than what resale is going for right now because of development fees, just to make the pro forma work. So we aren't incentivizing the private sector to build anymore, which has kind of, Trudeau has said we're going to build X amount of homes, which I think it turned out to be about 500,000 a year. And we're still stuck at half that. We're very much plateauing on the number of homes we're building. And when you think about the number of homes we're building, we're actually building more dense homes. So it's like we're not even building the detached home where you need to, dig down all these different basements, pour the concrete. Like I would actually think that might be a lot harder than building a condo building. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I do think that. So it's funny that you speak about how we're spending our tax dollars. I don't know if you recently saw they're changing a road name in Toronto to Taylor Swift Way for her concert, or they're renaming Dundas Square something else. And maybe these issues can have merit, but not when you're in a housing crisis, not when you're in an opioid crisis and a cost of living crisis. There's so many things we can go down. But I wanted to talk about oligopolies in Canada, so competition in Canada. It seems like a lot of people say, well, real estate's only expensive in Toronto and Vancouver. And then I've said this before on the podcast, and I've asked people who listen in other provinces, like, what do you guys think about when people say that? And they say, you should see how much we make here versus what you make in Toronto. Yeah. So it's all relative. And they go buy the same groceries. To be honest, they could even be more expensive than in Toronto, because when I went to Newfoundland, oh boy, was it expensive there. And it makes sense. I guess you got to ship there. It's a little further out there on the East Coast. But I wonder what your thoughts are. Is the housing crisis everywhere in this country? And I think that it's something to talk about where people don't feel, okay, well, maybe I just can't do this. I can't own a home. I can't have a family. And I feel like that's what a lot of young people feel right now, is kind of this lack of hope and that they're doomed for the future.
Well, exactly. And that's, one of the reasons why Kara and I started the Missing Middle podcast, to talk about those issues, to talk about the decline of the young urban middle class. And yeah, it is absolutely a real thing that, 15 years ago, I think you could make the argument that, housing was, just a, GTA, Greater Vancouver, issue. It really didn't affect the rest of the country, other than maybe Calgary at the time, just because of the oil boom. But over the last decade or so, it's really kind of propagated out like a wave, where you've got, those families going further and further, drive until you qualify families, which pushes up the price of existing housing. So my example for this is back in summer of 2017. This is you might remember this. This is when Morneau was finance minister and making changes to mortgage rules and that kind of thing. We sold our single detached home in London, Ontario. This is when we moved to Ottawa. So we get our agent, and she recommends a price, and I was just like, that is way too much for this place, and now it's worth like twice as much as it was then. So what do I know? But she suggests this number, and I'm like, oh, okay, that seems high, but whatever. And then we get all this interest, and we get 3 bids. And the interesting thing was, all the bidders and everybody was kicking the tires on this place. They were all moving from Toronto, and they were all either had young kids, or there was a baby bump, there's a baby on the way. And what was basically happening was, you had all of these young families, moving out to places like London or Kitchener-Waterloo or so on, and driving up the price of housing there. So, this number, which I thought was ridiculous, we ended up getting 15% over asking. So just because of this price. And you're absolutely right. What that does is it raises the price in those markets that, incomes are lower, right? So you end up displacing the locals, right? So you see that in a place like Kitchener-Waterloo, which got really expensive, again, closer maybe 2016. Now, if you're a nurse, and I keep picking on nurses, but now if you're a nurse in Kitchener, you're probably moving out to a Woodstock or Tilsonburg or that kind of thing, because you can't afford to live where you work anymore, right? So you're doing this long commutes. And then after the pandemic, where we all, a lot of us are able to work from home right now, and we're all using Zoom like you and I are right now. This became nationwide, right? So now people aren't just moving to Brantford or Thorold or wherever from the GTA. They're moving to New Brunswick. They're moving to Nova Scotia. So now we're seeing this housing crisis basically go across the country. And you have all of these kind of secondary markets like a Moncton and so on, that used to be really affordable, aren't anymore. That home prices have really detached from local wages. So yeah, if you go down the list and go, okay, look at where's affordable, you've got like Saskatchewan and like Brandon, Manitoba, and Edmonton's still not that bad relative to incomes. But yeah, this is largely a Canada-wide problem in a way that it wasn't a decade ago. And again, a lot of it's just migration. People moving out of the GTA, out of Greater Vancouver. We've had a big exodus out of Montreal as well. And then, moving further and further out, which has been facilitated by, increases in work from home.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, right? You're kind of what's the saying? You're pushing the can down the road. Like you said, Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, for God's sakes. Like even a detached old, side split there is $700,000 to $800,000. I mean, you run the mortgage numbers on that with 20% down. I promise you, it's not affordable. But that's what we see, and I help a lot of people leave the GTA. I helped a family move from Burlington, Ontario, and they moved to Calgary, right. or they moved to Edmonton because they could get a house for half the price, and they wanted to give their daughters an opportunity. They worked for Costco, and it was just an easy transition. But then you have the Ontario buyer going to Edmonton, and then the Edmonton local or the young millennial or Gen Z in Edmonton now has to face the Ontario buyer who just made $600,000-$700,000 on the sale of their home. And I'm not saying it's the Ontario buyer's fault. I'm just saying, like, we're just pushing the problem everywhere else. Halifax is an example that province absolutely boomed as well. I kind of wanted to pivot to something too. I noticed that you talked a lot about the environment, or you worked in the environment sort of sector a lot. What do you think about?
Yeah, so that's
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. That's a lot of the work that I do, and the sort of think tank I belong to is in the environment sector, which kind of seems strange that, okay, why is this guy who works in the environmental think tank world talking about housing? But the two interact with each other enormously. Part of it is just the building structure itself, and looking at energy efficiency and the actual land use decisions and things like that. But a lot of it is also just from transportation, right? That the fact that nurse in Kitchener is now getting forced out and having to move to Tilsonburg and is commuting 40 minutes each way by car, is actually a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and land use problems and so on. And it's actually one of the reasons why we have to spend so much money on infrastructure, is we're not allowing people to work where they live, or live where they work, which again works if it's work from home type jobs. But that's only about 30 to 40% of us who can do that, right? The rest have to show up to a workplace for whatever reason. So yeah, we look a lot at that intersection, and try and figure out, okay, well, how can we create neighborhoods that are more walkable? How can we create options for families so they don't, again, get forced out of the city and then have to commute back, drive back, and then all of a sudden we're adding another lane to the 401 at great taxpayer expense, when we'd be much better off finding ways to create homes in the cities, create homes in Kitchener to allow those nurses to live in Kitchener instead of living in Woodstock.
What are some of those solutions that you do see? How could we make that happen?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it's there's a lot of different things we can do. So one is zoning, making sure that we can build different housing typologies on different types of land. Another is building code. We have great buildings in Europe that multi-bedroom units that we can't really build here for a variety of reasons. One of them being rules around staircases. You need to have an apartment building. Basically, the design in North America is you need to have a staircase on either end, and that really limits the kind of design you can do, because you also want, and you have to by building code, every bedroom needs to have a window, right? So you get these kind of hotel type layouts, and it's really hard structurally to build an apartment building, have it 3 bedrooms, have every bedroom have a window, and then have this kind of hotel type layout. Like, it's just the geometry doesn't work. So we look at issues like that, and then really wonky things like elevator regulations can really sort of affect the cost of building, the ability to live in cities. But one of the biggest one, and this is the kind of the electric fence type issue, is urban growth boundaries. That this issue has become so politicized on all ends, particularly with the Greenbelt scandal here in Ontario, where you have some folks who want to expand these things, and then you get a lot of other folks, particularly again in my industry, it's like, no, you can't expand urban growth boundaries at all, and you just we just have to build in. I don't think that's particularly realistic. And what we see in cities like Ottawa, for instance, where you've got this tight urban growth boundary, well, it doesn't cause more development in Ottawa. What it does is push the development out to like the next town over, Carleton Place. So that's where you get the development. And then people are driving into Ottawa 40 minutes each way. Doesn't really help the matter. So I think we need to have much more sensible and pragmatic urban growth boundary expansions, and much more grown-up conversations about the green belt, because we've gotten this kind of polarized thing where you've got two sides yelling at each other, and it really is kind of a missing middle here, where we can't kind of think of long-term planning. I'm hopeful that will change. It's interesting to see in the last UK election, the Labour Party, the left-wing party, one of their key platform planks was identifying land in their green belt in the UK that doesn't really have much of a, a low environmental value, and say, okay, you know what, this shouldn't have been in the green belt in the first place. Let's take it out. Let's build housing there. So I think we need to have this kind of grown up conversation, and we're not having it in Ontario, right? That the lines are drawn, and the Ford government is really afraid to touch this issue because of some because of some issues around, the boundaries getting changed to help a particular developer or help a particular land speculator, rather than having a robust process of going, okay, like what should be in, what should be out, where should we be building, where should we not be building. We're not having that conversation. So what happens is we just don't build anywhere, and it leads to a worse housing crisis.
That's interesting to hear that from, I guess you could call yourself like an environment guy,
Yep.
because for me, when I heard about the Greenbelt, I was like, oh my God, awesome. They're going to build more housing, and then they're going to replace that land and they're going to put it somewhere else. So they weren't, in my understanding of it, they weren't taking away acreage. They were going to replace it somewhere else. And they were just putting it in places where you could have more density. I grew up in Oakville, Ontario, and I went to Western. So when I would do the drive, there's so much empty land. Like it's boring because you're like, what? There's nothing to look at. The only thing you have are these on routes to stop at and, go to Wendy's on, and, and then you'll see the temporary foreign workers working there too. But no, that's an interesting topic. Anything else you wanna leave with the listeners? I think you really did an awesome job, and I'm so grateful you came on because I learned a lot too. So I know my audience is going to learn a lot too. Any way people can support your work or help out and kind of getting involved in what you do?
Well, I think the biggest thing with, if you've enjoyed this conversation, check out the Missing Middle podcast. You can find it on YouTube. So we have a video version and an audio version that's on Spotify and all your favorite podcast places, where we talk about some of this stuff. Some of it is, more high level, where we say, okay, what's going on in the housing market or what's going on with temporary foreign workers. And some of our episodes are more wonky, where we talk about, okay, why is elevator regulations broken in North America, and how is that contributing to the housing crisis? So yeah, check us out. You just Google Missing Middle podcast, and you'll be able to find us.
Yeah, I'll link everything in the description below to find Mike. But yeah, we'll chat a little bit after I turn the recording off. But thanks so much for coming on, guys. It really helps having people like Mike, talk about issues for, I'm a millennial myself, and even the younger generation. I think a lot of boomers or doomers kind of they've made a lot of money in housing, and they're kind of, it's not really their fight. So we appreciate the work that you do, that's for sure. So thanks again, Mike. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.